I don't think it's anything new. That's what's exciting me about it. I think this is anything new. But the people that I have shared this with, there is a general confusion. A general confusion of if you don't have a few foundational things clearly understood, if you just go and read the scriptures and the plain reading of the scriptures, you may miss out on a lot because of a lack of fundamental understanding. I know most Christians, I've heard this said, I choose not to be this cynical, that most Christians don't actually diligently read their Bibles. But the truth is that the majority probably don't. The ones that do probably only read it from a cursory, what I did that for today, sort of, what's today? Today's the 25th. What have we Proverbs 25? You read Proverbs, and hey, but I'm going to do that every day, and I'll read through words of wisdom, and 12 times a year, and you got some of the rationale. But even if you, I was telling my family on the way up here, the majority of people today read their Bibles on things like this. Rarely do you see people anymore come to church with a paper Bible. And it's funny because you've got to distinguish a paper Bible, right? Like I'm happy to see a Bible at a Wednesday night Bible study. It's amazing, right? And it's great because listen, what version is that? So you've got New King James there, where you bring this along, and you've got 15 versions, right? And you can flip and go in between real quick, figure out which one you like the best. So, if, like, a lot of these Bible plans that people read nowadays, like on YouVersion, where you put passages notes, even a lot of them, you read kind of like a narrative from Genesis to Revelation, right? But in the reading of the Scripture, you're not necessarily reading it in the order of the events that took place. So you've almost got to discipline yourself that by the time you get to Amos, you've got to remember what was going on with Israel and what was the difference between Israel and who he was talking to and what events had happened before this and what was still to come, but wait a minute, that hadn't happened yet, so you can't be. And if you just kind of read the Scriptures just kind of through, you definitely become familiar. I shared with you guys that I read it about 3.5 times in 1 year last year, and it really helped me just to get a greater familiarity with it. But then I did them chronologically, chronological study. So my favorite part was reading the account of David. Whether it was the victory and triumph, and hearing the songs that he wrote after a big victory. You hear him praising the Lord, and thanking God, and you hear it. But then you also hear him after he sins and he kills Uriah. And you hear him in that song pour out his heart to the Lord, how grievous he was and what he had done. And you understand then, if you just read the account of David, and you hear that David was a man after God's own heart, you think, really? That guy? Seriously? He just was, but then you hear the songs written with the events of his life, you go, oh, he was grateful and gracious, and when things were going great, he was humbled and sorrowful, and As a former social studies teacher, that's what my degree was in history and social studies. I've always been fascinated with it. And more times than not, it's kind of the subject that most people couldn't, in school, didn't like. I mean, social studies is probably really up there in terms of what they didn't like. People liked science, but they weren't really good at it necessarily. They either good at math and loved it, or horrible at math and didn't like it, but that was a skill-based thing. And then, BE, language arts or English or whatever, kind of 50-50, right? But social studies is one of those things where most people don't really like it. And so, what I realized with the kids, we were looking for a way to teach the Bible as when we became children's pastors at in Harvey. I said, if you take the average kid today and you show them a timeline of anything and in any subject, they automatically accept it as fact. They don't question it. Whatever's up there, if there's going to be a date, a person, an event, and on a timeline, they just say, oh, that's true. And so why don't we teach the Bible the same exact way? Instead of teaching like a whole bunch of stories from a long, long time ago, let's teach the Bible from a historical standpoint. Let's show them when these things happen. Let's compare that when we're talking about the reign of David, that during the same time, that this was during the time of the Tushao Yang dynasty in China. Historical events. And so when I saw that Sparta, right, all the kids, they go out and they watch 300. Right? They watch these movies, we are Sparta, and all this other, and they watch these horrible movies, and don't even realize at the same time that was going on, David was sitting on the throne. They go, whoa, you mean, so the movie with those guys in the ass, and they're like, we are Sparta, you know. Like, yeah, that was happening at the same time that David was king, in your Bible. And then you start looking at the Bible as almost like a book of history, right? No longer just a bunch of stories, okay? So, with the time, let me show you this timeline. I don't know if you want to do it, I'll kind of push side to side. On this timeline, just focus on the white line and the orange, okay? So, here they come here's the Exodus, right? This is around 1491 BC, right? So here we go with the stories. Exodus, the wilderness, the promised land, they're in it. The time of the judges, right? And then they say, hey, we want to be like everybody else and have a king. Samuel gets all upset. God says, hey, what are you upset about? They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. They want a king. Give them a king. So they get a king. They get Saul. Saul's the king. And then Jonathan dies at the very end, tragically in the story. And then we get David. And David does wrong, and God judges Israel, and people, and all kinds of crazy things happening, you know, in my life. And then here comes Solomon. It's a concept that David. Solomon's right. He says, I'm going to rip the kingdom from your family's hand, but actually I'm just going to right? Give to your son, I'm going to give 2 tribes, and to your servant, I'm going to give the other 10, right? So we see at this really pivotal point in the history of God's chosen people. And I hesitate to use the word Israel at the moment, because just when you say Israel, there's a lot of things that it conjures up. So you think about, because today we have a nation on the planet Earth known as Israel, but those are not Israelites, which can be kind of confusing, because those Israelites, those people living in Israel are Jews, right? So we're going to talk about why. Because when the kingdom split, you had the northern kingdom, or what was known as the kingdom of Israel. Then you had the southern kingdom, known as the kingdom of Judah. But the northern kingdom of Israel was also referred to as the house of Israel. So you had the house of Israel versus the house of Judah. You also had the northern kingdom known as Ephraim, which was one of the half-tribes. One of the half-tribes of one of Joseph's sons. In fact, what's interesting was, remember, that was that Israel crossed his hand instead of the older, with the greater blessing of the right hand, he crossed the left Ephraim, the younger son. And Joseph said, hey, how can you do it? Yeah. Manasseh's I know. Manasseh's going to be a great nation. But Ephraim, the Bible says, will be, I think in the New King James says, will be a fullness of nations. Well, that's not common English. None of us talk about, you know, we would like to have a fullness of cars. I just you'd be like, what does that mean? A multitude. That from Ephraim, there would be a multitude of nations that come from it. Now that northern kingdom is often referred to as Ephraim, or the house of Joseph. So all of these terms, house of Joseph, house of Israel, kingdom of Israel, northern kingdom, we're all talking about a specific group of people. Now remember, the northern kingdom had about 19 kings. About 19 kings, none of them did good in the sight of God. Excuse me, I'm sorry. 14 kings. And none of them, all of them did evil in the sight of God. Okay? In fact, because the reason we know that is because that's what God says right before he judges them. Now what's really neat about this particular, these little graphs here, is that it also shows you the books of the Bible to go and read when these events are taking place. So, for instance, alright. So, for instance, here in 721 BC, you see the northern kingdom of Israel line come to an end. Okay? Because, well, do we or don't we? That was the house of Judah. Talk about that in a second. This is when the Assyrians came in. The Assyrians come in, and God judges the house of Israel because they always did evil. He tells his prophets, and specifically he says to Hosea, and if you notice the life of Hosea, look at the prophets. All of this line right here, this is the lifespan of the prophets. So if you notice, this line right here, from here to here, that's the life of Hosea. So at the end of Hosea's life, you go straight up. So when you read the book of Hosea, that is right before God is going to put judgment upon the house of Israel, and they're going to be taken away by the Assyrians, driven off their land, fulfilling the prophecy that was given to the entire nation of Israel in Deuteronomy right before they entered the promised land. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, he says, we're going to go into the promised land, y'all. It's going to be great. And for as much as I am going to love making you numerous on the earth, I will take as much delight in decimating you, because you're going to leave me, and you're going to force me to scatter you among the Gentiles to the ends of the earth. Now you hear that, and from what I have always heard is the conflation between that happening and the fulfillment of that prophecy happening with the Jews in 70 AD, when the temple is destroyed and the Romans finally expel the Jews out of the Holy Land and never come back again until we see 1948, right? Which means that if that's of the view and your understanding of it up to this point, then that means you miss completely the entire New Testament. See what I mean? This chart here is a new ministry. Most of it is purpose of it is the ministry of Christ. But this will be Israel's storyline. Okay? Here is 7 AD. So we know in 70 AD, we know right here it says the temple destroyed, Andrew crucified. But the temple destroyed, that's an unarguable time in history. Even secular history admits the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Now watch this. All of these books right here, look what it says, the books of the New Testament, all of these books were written, the entire New Testament was written before 70 AD, except for the 3 epistles of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and the book of Revelation. So what that means is that whenever you're reading, for instance, the first book written in the New Testament, chronologically, is the book of James. So when you cross over and you're reading, and you want to read the New Testament in the order in which it was written, from a time standpoint, it'll also give you a clue as to why what was written was written. So watch this. So the book of James opens up. So imagine starting, you finish Malachi, you flip over 2 pages where it says New Testament, and the first book you read is not Malachi. You open up James, it says, fellow brothers and sisters, a bondservant of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 times each You get great Bibles that are in chronological order. I personally only do like my daily reading with the chronological Bible plan on my phone because it's just telling me what to read. So it makes it a little bit simple. I have to go hunt for it and pull up to every day, read 3 or 4 chapters in the course of the year. And what's really cool is you can also do it in 90 days. They have chronological Genesis to Revelation in 90 days. A little more reading, a little more time consuming, obviously, but just fascinating nevertheless because it reads like a story instead of reading like a bunch of disjointed ancient Hebrew scriptures, right? So all of the New Testament is written before the Jewish diaspora or the Jewish dispersion into all the rest of the world. Now, go back to we never lose time Jews. At the time of Jesus, Jesus himself was a Jew. He's the Lion of Judah, right? Paul himself says, "I'm a Jew. I'm a big." At the time of Jesus, you were still able to, in the Southern Kingdom, they were able to trace their bloodline all the way back to Abraham. And the covenant, the material possession covenant, Paul says, is irrevocable. Now, as a former insurance salesman, when I'd ask, do you want his death benefit, you want to be a beneficiary, or do you want to be an irrevocable beneficiary? He said, well, what does that mean? He said, well, that means that if he decides he don't like you anymore, and he gets paid on that policy, he can name that next wife. She said, no, I'm going to be irrevocable. And of course, we joke. I tell the guy, hey, make sure you sleep with one eye open. That's whatever she gives you to drink. So, it says that the blessings of Abraham, and he clarifies, he says, and not just the actual seed of Abraham, but including those that are and the modern church kind of stylizes it as in kind of a spiritual way. Now, I want to pause for a second. I want to get something while I'm thinking about it. Because ecclesia, since 2 weeks ago, drove me nuts. Right? Because it was a great question. So the first thing I did is of course, you just do a general church and you look up Old Testament. I use a free Bible software called The Word. It's a free Bible software that does comparison. It's a phenomenal piece of software. You don't have to spend thousands of dollars on like logos and stuff. Okay? Of course, in the English version of the Bible, in no English, no ancient English, all the way from King James. Even I have a 1599 Geneva Bible, the actual Bible that they used when they crossed the Atlantic on the Mayflower, right? The Pilgrims had. It actually predates the King James version. So in no English Bible, including modern translations, will you find the word church in the Old Testament. So you go, of course, because you go into the New Testament and you read the Greek. The Greek word for church, and most people remember this because it's been beaten to our head that we are the church, and it's ecclesia, right? So we know that kind of that etymology of the words. So when you look at the definition of ecclesia, what you don't see is you don't see anything real specific. It's kind of more of a general term, like assembly, congregation, gathering of people, like-minded people. Right? That's kind of the definition. You think, oh, that's kind of, yeah, I can see that. I can see on a Sunday morning, here we are, we're gathered, we all love and serve Jesus, so we come together, and we come together as the church. It's a gathering, it's an assembly, it's a congregation, right? Right? So, the Septuagint is a version of the Bible that was written in 70 AD. So it was a Greek, the first time that there was a Greek Old Testament. So we have a Greek, from Hebrew to Greek Old Testament, as well as the Greek New Testament in the Septuagint. So if you take the Septuagint and you translate the Septuagint into the same original manuscript of the Greek New Testament into English, every Testament, our now modern English Bible says it was the assembly of Israel. The the congregation of the people of Israel gathered. All of those words in the Septuagint say ecclesia. The word church is all over the Old Testament in the Greek translation of it. So what happened is there's no ecclesia-like word in Hebrew. So when you pull it from Hebrew to English, you get the definition of the word that we use in the Greek, because you're doing two different languages. So this idea that the church started in the New Testament, and that somehow the church hadn't started because it wasn't in the Old Testament, and people would even defend it by saying, find the word church in the Old Testament. What about what Jesus said? And upon this church, upon this rock, I will build my church. That was the one you brought up specifically. Well, you understand that he was saying that upon this rock, this revelation of me as the Messiah, this assembly, this congregation, I'm going to build this congregation, this assembly. I'm going to, on that nation alone, it's been revealed to you, it had hidden from the northern kingdom and from the Jews who God told his prophets. In Jeremiah, he told them, he said, look, Judah, don't you know I divorced your sister for her whoring ways among the nations? I sent her away. I scattered her like sheep to the Gentiles to live to the corners of the earth. But I'm coming back for her. I'm going to take her back. So here's what happened. When you understand the Torah side of the law, that said, and some of this is review, but we have a couple of new folks here, so I'm bringing everybody up to speed. Deuteronomy says, if you marry a woman, give her a bill of divorce, put her out your house, send her away, but she's been given a certificate of divorce. She goes to marry another man, he does the same thing. When she becomes divorced the second time, the first husband can't take her back because you're going to bring a curse on the land. So it's illegal to divorce your wife and then bring her back, otherwise you bring a curse upon yourself and the land. Paul even has to go a little bit further to explain this. He said, brothers and sisters, I don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery. Well, what was the mystery? The mystery was God said in his Torah that you cannot take back the bride that you have divorced. And he says in Hosea, he says, Hosea, man of God, prophet of mine, to both Judah and Israel, go marry Gomer, that prostitute. Marry her. And she's going to have children. Illegitimate children from her clientele. And I want you to take them in too. Because he says, I want to use your relationship. So what does Hosea do? Hosea takes her. But then she says, I don't want to do this. And the Bible literally says, Gomer wanted to go and have relations with other men. So Hosea's like, well, look, I did what God said. I married her. I knew she was a prostitute before. I guess it's kind of what to be expected. And God says, now go get her and bring her back. He doesn't say, go ask her if she wants to come back. He says, go redeem her. Go get her and bring her back. And when he does, he says, and he literally, Hosea, the way it's written in the scripture says, I'm going to use this relationship as an illustration to what I will one day do with Israel. Now, it's key for us to know that these 10 tribes, for what we now know to be, it's almost kind of become the lost tribes of Israel. Who are they? Where did they go? Some people say that those lost tribes, they went, if you read the book of Ezra, it says that, we're going to go out to the farther lands where people don't even exist. And they went to Crimea, right? And they went to the Celtic and the Anglo-Saxon Celts, that those people are lost tribes. There's people who actually believe that, like, the bloodline of the kings of England, the kings and queens of England, are representative of the lost tribe of Israel. The Mormons believe that they are the lost tribe, Ephraim. They believe they are Ephraim on the earth today. that they're a part of the lost tribes. There are groups of people called Black Hebrew Israelites who believe that every black, brown, and dark skinned person on earth is in tribes of Israel. Okay, so what I know is most of these theories come off of the false race, in which the Bible crushes when it says in one blood all. So they number one race, and what makes us different in terms of our shade, we're all brown, which is different varying degrees of brown. We're either really light brown, or we're really dark brown, or somewhere in between. And we know now, because of modern education, it's a little chemical known as melanin. So it's melanin. If you have a tremendous amount of melanin in your makeup, you're going to be really dark skinned. If you have very little melanin in your skin, that's what you're going to have. You're not going to have a lot of dark coloring in your skin. And for people who are really light that don't have a lot of melanin, if they go out to the sun for a while, that the sun can help create melanin, and that's why you tan. So the first thing we got to figure out is we got to stop perpetuating this idea even within the church that they got black churches and they got white churches, and they got black Christians and they got white Christians, and we just got brown Christians. That's all we got. Because there's only brown people on the earth. If you really, I did this thing with our kids, this curriculum of kid children, and they got one little like milk white little white baby with blonde hair and blue eyes on one side, and they got this little dark, like this little Akshaba Makiki Holmes, real dark skin, like she just straight out of Africa, right? Dark skin, and they got every other shade in between. And I just asked the kids, who on this thing is white? And they would say, well, the kid on the end. Who on here is black? And he said, well, the kid on the other end. I said, well, what about the other 15 in the middle? He said, well, we don't know. I'm like, exactly. You've been programmed to think if somebody's darker than you, or they're black. And I said, there's nobody in there. I said, if you're black, you just came out of a house fire or something. And I said, you thought you were white? You ain't we got Bible. And we got I'm just saying, you take information and I do research, you'll make and what you will find some lot of people that believes. Everybody believes that I am one of Father Abraham's sons. Then there's some kind of inheritance waiting for you. So it's almost like a lottery ticket. And excuse me, you'd be like, I am from the tribe of Issachar. And you're like, all right, so? You're like, no, I'm due something. Like, you do what? This is part of what Paul was talking about in the New Testament when he says that, look, there is a cultivated olive tree. And he says that one tree has had some of its branches broken off. And God has gone to the wild olive tree and taken some of those branches and grafted them into the wild olive tree. But in the Old Testament, God says, this is before the split of the two kingdoms, he says, O Israel, talking about the United Kingdom, you are like a green olive. And he specifically names. So Israel, so now we can go to the terms. Let's kind of walk through some of the terms here. We have to, let's change when we start reading some of the scriptures, because you won't just be thinking Jews. Because today's Jews, they are the same ones, that the ones who practice rabbinicism, the same ones that Jesus was fussing at in the New Testament. Like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, what they have done since the time of the last prophet and the 400 years in between, during what they call the period of Maccabees, if you will, is they created a system. They took God's law, the Torah, and they made like man-made law, almost like a constitution. They made like a civic government out of it. But they made it burdensome. And they made it in a way that they could walk around and maintain power and have awe from the people, because they could say, hey, we keep the moral law of God. And we also do all these other things. And people are like, oh, I could never be that holy. Here's some money. And they would sit up there in the temple, and they would have, all these different temple offerings. You'd go and give money and everything. It was just amazing, right? So here's some of the terms that we have to keep very clear. By the way, what do you think about this today? Today there are over 41,000 Christian denominations. 41,000 different denominations of Christianity. Now look, if we had this correct, I think we would have a little more unity. Okay? But I mean, if you really think about, like, again, I'm stressing history here. Okay? But if we went back and looked at it from a historical standpoint, after the first, second, third century, after Jesus' ascension, and the church explodes, we'll talk a little bit about why in a second, because I don't necessarily think it was just, although it was an incredible move of the Holy Spirit, I don't think it is in terms of the context of today. Okay? I'll get that in a second. You've got about 1,500 years of Roman Catholicism. Okay, now look, again, I know a lot of folks came out of Roman Catholicism. I've into a family who came out of Roman Catholicism. Okay? You cannot discount the fact that this was the only church from about 300 A.D. all the way to the Protestant Reformation. And here's the other thing. The Protestant Reformation was done by a bunch of Catholic priests. And you guys, Martin Luther hated the Jews. Calvin hated the Jews. The Jews, bottom line is, the Jews, hear my heart. But they all, as part of, when they got their dispersion, they have remained unrepentant. That God tells them in the Old Testament that you're going to go to places and worship in places where you've never even heard their God. But you're never going to be able to have rest. And you look at the history
of the New Testament. I believe that Jesus said, I was sent only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But when you see that term, you got to ask yourself, wait a minute, I thought John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he sent his only son. I thought Jesus came to save the world. Jesus did come to save the whole world, but he was sent to redeem the house of Israel, because Israel had become Gentile. So let's look at that word. Gentile is different than pagan. Gentile is different than heathen. So you got Gentiles, pagans, and heathens. Gentile, think of it like this. If they were not a Jew from Judea or the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom, they were Gentile.
So even northern?
Well, by this time, because remember, if we're talking about Jesus, say 33 AD, right? He was born, now we got 0, right? 33 years later, he's hanging on the cross and dies. So at that time, you're talking about 750 years from this point right here, where this line ends. So they were scattered amongst the nations. They became Gentile. Now even Josephus goes in the Antiquity of the Jews. He talks about the Hebrews living a number so big you couldn't count on the other side of the Euphrates River. They knew that their brothers, and now watch, brothers and sisters, we have stylized that phrase, I'm not calling you, but stylized sisters. But I believe,